Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I can see we're losing people. I know a few people have gone to airports, and we wish them a happy return flight. Thank you to anyone who's online still. I must jump down and get the iPad to make sure that you're available on the chat, because we will hopefully have time for questions. This is, of course, you might know some of the people, the regulatory framework for space resource activity. These legal experts are going to talk about policy making and discuss the current regulatory framework for space resource activities, focusing on international cooperation and the development of laws that support space exploration and resource utilization. So we have Stephen Freeland, who is the Vice Chair of the Working Group on Legal Aspects of Space Resource Activities, and he's going to talk about UN COPA's progress for the future international framework development. We have Emily Pierce, who is the Attorney Advisor at the US Department of State. She will talk about the Artemis Accords. And Alban Guyomarc'h is the Destination Moon Working Group Coordinator at ANRT in France and a member of Euro2Moon. And he will talk about the private law perspective. So whilst I jump down to get the iPad to make sure the online people ask questions, I invite Stephen, here's Stephen, to talk.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. We can't see you, but we know it's an absolutely full house because you've all been waiting with bated breath to hear from the law panel. So thank you. You know, you had to put up with all of the boring scientific and entrepreneurial and economic stuff. So this is the exciting panel. So, you know, I hope it's worth it. We've like to talk to you about the regulatory frameworks and ideas about space resources. And from my perspective, I'm an international lawyer, but I'm speaking to you on behalf of myself and my colleague, Ambassador Andrzej Misztal, who cannot make it here today. We are the chair and vice chair of a United Nations working group, and I'll explain what that means briefly, that is mandated by the 102 countries of this United Nations body, and that includes everybody you would expect, all of the countries, to essentially look at possibilities for potential legal frameworks for what we call space resource activities. I'll click that. Now, there's lots of words here. Don't worry about this, because it's really just a timeline about the development of our working group, but if I'll try to work through it quickly. Why do we need law for space resources? I don't know whether that's been covered in some of the other panels, but as no doubt all of you are far more aware of than I am, this is a really complex area. And the implications of space resource activities, whatever that might be, and we, you know, from my perspective, don't exactly know what that might look like. But the implications are not just in terms of economics and not just in terms of science, but it's about national security, it's about exploration, it's about law, it's about ethics and culture and indigenous perspectives, First Nations perspectives. It's about so many implications. And from a legal perspective, space is an area that we call beyond national jurisdiction. So, you know, you can call it whatever you want, but essentially you and I and all people in the world have a stake in this. And you might think that sounds altruistic, but that is the reality in terms of the legal capacity and the categorization of space. And I often say that space literally touches every person on the planet. And of course, every country on the planet, and therefore all of their citizens, are directly impacted by our interrelationship with space. And if we get it wrong and screw it up, and you know, no doubt there's been discussions about debris, even and the environment in the context of resources, but generally, if we get it wrong, then we will all suffer. So it's important to have an understanding about how we engage in whatever activities in space, and here we're talking about space resource activities, how we engage in that in a way that, as I always put it, maximizes the benefits and minimizes the risks. There are always going to be risks in anything. They're technological, they're environmental, they're political, they're security related. There are always risks, but there are incredible benefits to space. And you've heard, no doubt, in these 2 or 3 days, and I forgot to thank the organisers for inviting me, and this is a fantastic conference, so thank you so much. And you've heard in this fantastic conference all of those benefits. But there are risks as well, and no doubt you're aware of that. So at the United Nations level, remembering that we all have a stake in space, you know, it's not capable of 1 or 2 or 5 countries saying this bit's ours. It doesn't work like that from a law perspective, and there are deep, deep political ramifications for attempting to do otherwise. So from a United Nations perspective, it's important, I think, to try to work out an understanding, given that, you know, multiple countries and groups of countries and private entities want to engage in these activities, whatever they might look like, that it's important that we find some common understandings. Because what we have to avoid, in my opinion, is that you're going to have different groups of countries and their private entities or whatever, essentially operating in relatively close geographic proximity, trying to do much the same thing, and that may not be always the case, but much the same thing in a deeply hazardous environment. You know how difficult it is, and operating in their mind's eye under different rules. So from my perspective, and this is a personal view, we need to have a common understanding, even amongst countries that are competing with each other, even amongst companies that are competing with each other. And that's what this process through the United Nations is. And so there's a body in Vienna, and I apologize if you are aware of this, but some may not. There's a body in Vienna, a UN agency called the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Now, I have the honor of being part of the Australian delegation. Emily is part of the US delegation. That committee, it's a UN agency. It's got 102 countries, all of the countries you'd expect. It's growing every year. It's one of the bigger UN agencies. It's tasked, amongst other things, with looking at how we work out a governance framework for activities in space, including this. And the way that works is, at that UN body, if they decide something is worthwhile talking about and serious, they put it as an agenda item. You might think that's silly. You can put anything as an agenda item, but remember, you've got then 102 countries potentially giving statements on each item, so there's only a limited amount of time. So once something is decided by consensus, all decisions are by consensus, once something is decided to be a discussion item, it's on the agenda. And once COPOS decides, okay, this is really interesting, let's move it to what I might call an action item, they decide, again by consensus, to establish what's called a working group. A working group is not 5 people. A working group is 102 countries, but it's the methodology to then do things. And the working group's then given a mandate. And so there's a working group on legal aspects of space resource activities. I have the honour of being the Vice Chair, Ambassador Misztal from Poland, the Chair. We have a 5-year mandate. Amongst the things we need to work out in our mandate is what's going on and what's real, what's not, even from a technical viewpoint, because that will then inform any governance we put together. Then we look at the existing legal framework. I won't bore you with the detail, but there is a substantial existing legal framework that is relevant but not comprehensive. Then it'll look at whether there are gaps in that framework, and then it will say, okay, with all of that in mind, part of our mandate in the 5 years is to come up with relatively high-level principles about how all of this activity might be conducted. And out of that, the member states, we answer to the member states, we serve the member states, will then decide what they want to do from there. But that's what we're doing, and we're looking at substantive issues now about what are those high-level principles that that everybody can participate in the process of creating, but therefore all act under the same rules. And so we've done a lot of work. There's a lot of work being done. Yesterday here in Luxembourg, our working group convened, and it was generously hosted by Belgium and Luxembourg and supported by the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. We had a one-day symposium, expert meeting downstairs where we had representatives from many countries, industry representatives, academia, talking about the technical stuff. And so we're moving forward. We've got lots of conferences. We meet every year. We have intersessional meetings. And essentially, with the goodwill of the member states, we will, in a few years' time, come up with high-level rules, which I think, excuse me, are really important if we are to do this to, as I say, maximize the benefits, minimize the risks. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll pass over so we can have questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, that's very kind of you. You noticed my little movement on the chair. I just want to open up the floor to questions, but we'll take the questions at the end of the talk. So, Emily, over to you. It should be on, actually.
Oh, it's on. Great. I'll just wait for my presentation to come up. But hi, everybody. I'm Emily Pierce. I'm an attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of State. And I'm our head of delegation to the legal subcommittee at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And so I'm an international lawyer by training. I did not have any background in space or even really science beyond maybe a year in college. So this has been a really exciting role for me to have international law interface with economics and commerce and with science and technology. And the reason why states care so much about the work that you all are doing is because of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. In Article 6 of the treaty, it states that states have international responsibility for the activities, their national activities in outer space, including the activities of non-governmental actors. So that means our businesses that are launching into space. Those activities, the U.S. government could be potentially internationally responsible for, but also potentially internationally liable for damage caused by those activities. So we care a lot about how these activities are conducted. We want them to be conducted, as Stephen said, reducing the risk, so increasing safety, increasing sustainability. And so that's where the United States, along with 7 of our initial partners on the Artemis Accords, started to realize that there was an urgent need to take the principles from the Outer Space Treaty and start to put a little more meat on the bones, try to operationalize very broadly applicable principles in a little more granular way. I won't say that the accords are very technical or highly detailed, but they do help us to provide some more ground rules for how we are going to live and work together as we move on to the moon and beyond. So we initially started, so what are the Artemis Accords? The Artemis Accords are, the purpose is to establish a common vision through a practical set of legally non-binding principles, guidelines, and best practices to enhance governance of civil space exploration and use of outer space as we live and work together going into deep space. We started with, like I said, 8 countries that are planning to participate in the Artemis missions. So Australia, Canada, Italy, the UK, UAE, Japan, and of course, last but not least, Luxembourg. And then as of today, we have 36 signatories. There are not 36 Artemis mission partners. And by signing up to the Accords, you are not automatically a participant in NASA's Artemis program. They're two separate things, although they, of course, related and complementary. But we do have many non-Artemis Accords, non-mission partners that are participating in the Artemis Accords. And that's out of the acknowledgement that as my South Korean colleague mentioned in a panel at this conference on Monday, emerging spacefaring countries and even non-spacefaring countries want to be a part of space resource utilization, and they want to be a part of how humanity is exploring and using deep space. They want a seat at the table. And so all of these Artemis Accords signatories come together. They each have a voice in our discussions on how we're going to implement each of these principles in practice. And I can tell you that it's if you have skin in the game, if you have a voice in the process, it really helps to make sure that we're all moving forward together. So almost immediately, I think, after the Accords were introduced, they were analyzed by legal scholars, by practitioners, and we had some reluctance to accept the Accords. Some of that was based not on substance, but on geopolitics. There are frankly, countries that have general allergies to anything that the United States could possibly be involved in. So I totally understand that dynamic, and that's certainly to be expected. One of the more substantive criticisms that I wanted to sort of talk about today and address is the criticism that the Accords promote through the section on space resources that we're going to, there's going to be a land grab on the moon or somewhere else. And this, I found this visual the other day, and I thought it was actually quite cute. This idea that we're just trying to capture the moon. And that's that criticism is based in Section 10 on the space resources, and then Section 11 on deconfliction of space activities. So I wanted to sort of take that criticism and analyze it a bit more based on what the Accords actually say and what they actually do. And Section 10 on space resources really has sort of 4 incremental steps. One, the first paragraph of Section 10, the signatories merely note that the utilization of space resources can benefit humankind by providing critical support for safe and sustainable operations. This is something that I think has been a key takeaway for me as a legal person and not a scientist, is that you all are focused on how space resource utilization can help to further space exploration in a sustainable way. How can we produce propellant in space, and how can we pursue we heard from Blue Origin on Monday talking about how they can produce solar panels from a lunar regolith. And so those types of activities, that's basically just a recognition that that is the purpose and the goal of space resource utilization, and that's the benefit to humanity. And the second paragraph is just about compliance with the existing legal framework, the Outer Space Treaty. The first sentence emphasizes that the extraction and utilization of space resources has to be done in a manner that complies with the Outer Space Treaty. Just because you are engaged in an activity and you're a private entity doesn't mean that there aren't rules here. There are rules related to free access. All states parties to the Outer Space Treaty have free access to all areas of the moon. How are we going to implement that when we have potentially 2 companies or 2 countries that want access to a particular area? This is a statement that we are going to work on the procedures to work that out. The second sentence is the signatories, and maybe this is the most interesting statement from a legal perspective. The signatories affirm that the extraction of space resources does not inherently constitute national appropriation under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. And Article 2 is the non-appropriation principle. It basically says that states cannot claim national sovereignty over territory on the moon or anywhere else in outer space, whether it's through claim or use. So that's the key. I think that's the crux of the criticism of the Artemis Accords, is that we're saying if you extract space resources from the moon, that's not inherently national appropriation of that territory, of that area over the moon. The third step is that we're going to share information about what we're doing, and that's actually also further compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. We're going to submit information about these activities to the Secretary General of the United Nations. That's compliance with Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty, and we're going to provide information to the public and international scientific community through a normal course of how science is shared through journals and conferences such as this. And then the fourth step is we are going to participate in multilateral processes. We're going to participate in COPUOS. We're going to take the experiences that we have in implementing the Artemis Accords, in working in the Artemis program to help inform the negotiations at COPUOS. That's a critical piece of this section, because there is a view that what happens outside of the UN is illegitimate and not valid because it's lacking from participants from the entire international community. So it's really important to Accord signatories that we bring these experiences to the international dialogue and that we participate actively in that dialogue so that the entire international community can develop alongside with what we're doing with the Artemis Accords. It's not a parallel universe that we're trying to establish. It's just the recognition that there was an urgent need to move forward because our missions are launching and the UN processes take time. It takes time to generate consensus, and with good reason. States are not going to bind themselves to new binding obligations or international voluntary commitments without really hashing out all the details.
Thank you, Emily. I need to move on if that's possible. To leave
Yeah,
time for
please.
questions. Thank you. So, Alban, if you could try to make it short, then we can keep time for questions as well.
Yeah, no
Thank
problem.
you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased and quite humbled to be here today, especially speaking next to Stephen Freeland and Emily Pierce. I'm here with two capacities. The first one, of course, as mentioned before, is the one of coordinator of the Destination Moon Working Group, which is a working group working in France since 2019 on European lunar ambitions. We are working on them and promoting them to the general audience, but also to public policy stakeholders, and especially to French Parliament. And my second capacity to be here is the one specifically, well, probably actually the capacity more useful to this panel is the one of PhD candidate in space law, but I don't work on public law aspects, but on private international law issues. Originally, I was asked to give some industry perspective about space law as a Euro2Moon member. My big problem being I don't know how to make a rocket or even though launching a satellite. So I cannot give an industry perspective, but rather one of an observer of industry practice of space law. So I made a counter-proposal to the organizers, proposing them actually to explore the dark side of space law, and not to abuse a metaphor, but the dark side of space law being private law. And in order to explain what I mean by a private law perspective, I will take a quite contemporary example, especially a one well known from the jurisdiction I'm speaking here today, which is property of space resources. Because when in 2015 and 2017, US and Luxembourg spearheaded in positive law the idea of property titles on space resources, very much was said, and legitimately, about the conformity to Article 2 of such new ideas into space law. But on the other hand, little has been said about private law aspects of those elements, and more specifically, private international law aspects of such new legal innovations. Well, first thing probably that has to be said is that there is no international obligations for third states to recognize the legitimacy and the legality of property titles on space resources. And this was specifically underlined by the the analysis of the Luxembourg Council of State in 2017 by the project, with the worry from the Luxembourg Council of State of the possibility for an appropriated space resources to circulate from one country to another with the property title recognized by each state, or even the capacity for this property title to go from one legal person to another if each legal person is in state A or B. But if you go a bit further about the private law analysis of property title on space resources, there are some new questions arising, and especially the first one being, what law do you apply to the property title of a resource acquired in an international space? The next question, already mentioned, is the one of the capacity for these property titles on a private law dimension to circulate from a state to another. And, well, not unrelated to this, in the particularly volatile industry linked to space resources, how do you manage the transfer of property titles on space resources in the case of a bankruptcy or an international bankruptcy of startups? But this is technical issues, and what I want to get is more particularly into political analysis, economical political analysis of property of space resources from a private perspective. Because basically, what is property of space resources a real name of? I mean, what is the idea that in 2015 and in 2017, two jurisdictions decided to recognize one day property titles on space resources? Well, the basic answer from a private law perspective is to say that if you want to make a market, you need property. Basically, property on space resources is the translation into legal terms of a physical appropriation of resources, and it's actually transforming these resources into a transferable asset from one person to another. Meaning that if you want to have a market on space resources, you actually needed property on space resources. It was economically necessary, both in an economic necessity, as I just said, but also in a legal necessity. Because if you want to sell resources, you need to get property on them. Meaning, if you get a bit more into the analysis, that we see here a new role, and it's actually interesting from an industry perspective, a new role of national space laws. Past national space laws were actually designed to implement into national law international obligations of state, especially the one mentioned by Emily just before of authorizing space operations. But now we go far beyond that element. Well, far beyond. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but we go at least a little beyond that objective of implementing international obligations, because now national space laws are more and more leveraged as a tool for economic policy and economic strategies for states. I mean, here in Luxembourg, we can really see it, because after 2017 and the decision to implement property titles on space resources, well, to that legal policy was associated a real state investment into the sector, into space resources development. And we now have in Europe a hub, being Luxembourg, for space resources. We see here the benefits of an association of an economic policy and a legal policy. Well, and if we actually go a bit further to the, I think, 3 minutes remaining on my intervention, we can go a bit further on a private law perspective, and I would like to put aside for a second the question of space resources, even though what I'm going to say is not unrelated, and go on another aspect. What if we look from a private law perspective to technical standards, technical norms? Well, it's a bit like, for space lawyers, it's a bit the geek issue, technical norms, but I think it's a quite paramount issue to look at. And if you look at it, well, technical standards are an instrument of economic and political regulation of space development, well, giving rise to an idea I quite like, and I borrowed to a colleague, which is the one of an engineer legislator. Because when you analyze these technical regulations from the perspective of a private law, well, it raises the question about their development by the space industry and their international scope, both ratione materiae and ratione personae, but also in a globalized space economy, you have to ask, how do we make these standards? How would you apply them into contractual relations, into insurance obligations, but also how, industry stakeholders actually develop these standards. May it be for docking, may it be for transfer of resources from machine A to machine B on the moon. And we really have to be aware of the importance, in a private law perspective, of these technical standards, and especially with IP issues. Well, I actually tried in this very short intervention to mention how when you get to private law into space law, you actually have a whole range of new issues raising, which are not generally looked at from a public international law perspective. And I try to generally repeat this metaphor I use a lot, but I think a space lawyer in the 21st century is actually moving from chamber music to symphonic orchestra and being a conductor in charge of harmoniously, meaning strategically mobilize a whole range of new instruments into his orchestra, being international law, national law, technical standards, contracts, insurance, hybrid sources, Artemis Accords, and every source is mobilizable. And it's quite hard actually to make all these sources coordinated and act, both intricated but also distinct. And finally, really to conclude, even if I spoke about private law, I think we lawyers basically know how important is the involvement of the state and its public law into space, because we generally hear, sometimes even here, that in the new space economies, the state tend to disappear. Well, it's legally false, because basically you've got to have an authorization by state at a moment A or B to go into space. State is not disappearing, it's even true legal, on a legal perspective. But as I said, now that national space laws are a tool for economic policy, it's even more important to have a strong legislature in the space domain.
Thank you very much for saving a couple of minutes there as well. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions online from Francesco Lucci. We've got about 11 minutes for questions. I would love to have some questions from the floor as well, so hopefully roving mics can pick up if there's any hands up. Questions from Francesco Lucci. Lunar data commercialization. Given what is stated in the Artemis Accords about the commitment to share data publicly, would a private company who will collect lunar data be forbidden to sell such data?
I assume that question's for me. I think it depends on what the relationship is of that company with the US government. So if it's a NASA mission, for example, there are requirements with respect to release of scientific data that NASA would have ownership over. But of course, all of that release is subject to applicable domestic law, which may be related to export control or IP. So there is an open science policy at NASA, and if that operator has a relationship, a contractual relationship with NASA, there may be requirements to release that data. If it's a company that's operating in outer space that for purely commercial reasons, then there are requirements with respect to providing information to our regulators, and there are requirements for providing information for space situational awareness and space traffic coordination purposes. But I'm not aware that there are sort of legal requirements that they have to provide other types of data.
There's a couple more questions coming in directed really to you, Emily, one specifically for you, which perhaps we'll come to. But first of all, I want to open it to the floor in the room. Yes, we have hands up. I hope somebody has a mic to these hands. as quickly as possible because I don't want to be late for the next section. So we've got 4 hands in this region. Why don't we stand up, and I want to save time, so just ask your question and I'll try to repeat it for those online.
Emily, you mentioned that the OST could potentially put liabilities on the signatory states for damages done. Does that extend to environmental damage?
So the principle in the Outer Space Treaty, as articulated in the Liability Convention, there is a particular definition of damage. Damage caused by the space object to another space object, to property or person. So given, I think it would be a complex analysis, given that there is no property ownership of like the space environment permitted under Article 2, I think that would be a complex analysis.
Question for Vice Chair, Professor Freeland. So we've had the international conference yesterday. We have the expert meeting, which is happening on the first day of legal subcommittee. What is the outcomes of that, and how do they build into the ongoing work of the working group? Like, what's the plan for 2024 and 2025? And question for the other panelists was more general in nature. What topics in space resources, what issues in space resources are best governed at the international level at COPUOS, and which topics and issues in space resources are best left to national discretion?
Shall I go first? Yeah. Thanks. I think that was Chris, yes? Thank you, Chris. You'll recall I mentioned that in the mandate of the working group, remember this is a mandate that was agreed by all of the countries. This is what they want. And that mandate essentially said, first thing we need to do is gather information about what's going on and what is possible, not just from a quote-unquote legal perspective, but from a technical perspective. What is the current practices? And, you know, as amazing as some of the delegations are at the COPUOS and, you know, looking at the development of governance, they don't have a grasp of the technical considerations, the scientific considerations, the economic considerations, the cultural considerations, all of those things I mentioned before. And so it was agreed that we would have a series of conferences, the one yesterday, an expert meeting, feeding into a formal conference in Vienna in a couple of weeks, where we would invite countries to nominate experts, non-legal, hopefully, although we obviously want to hear from lawyers as well, but non-legal experts to start telling us what is possible. Because I always say, you know, how can you regulate for the unknown if it's completely unknown? And that is what essentially we're looking to do. So we need to understand all of those questions, all of those technical considerations. That's what the conference yesterday and the one in Vienna will do. It will feed, it will further inform the COPUOS, but I'm not saying it's comprehensive. We need to learn and learn and learn and learn. Just on the second question, I know it's addressed to the others, but you know, from my perspective, the most important issue is that we avoid the possibility, the risk of conflict and misunderstandings and miscalculations. If you look at the history, being a bit dramatic here, if you look at the history of humankind, the vast majority of wars terrestrially have been about resources and claims for territory and things like that. And, you know, clearly I'm not transposing that to space, but we need to minimize. So at that multilateral level, we need to find the fundamental rules that everybody has, as Emily said in the context of Artemis, everybody has skin in the game in terms of the opportunity to contribute to the establishment of whatever those understandings are, to minimize that risk of conflict. That has to be, in my opinion, at the multilateral level. Now, in terms of smaller, more technical issues, I'll defer to my colleagues. Thanks, Chris.
Just on that point, though, have you thought, I'm sure you have thought deeply, about how you could monitor this in the future and enforce?
Yeah, I mean, everybody says that space law is unenforceable. And in fact, that's a criticism that's often levelled at other elements of international law and other legal frameworks. You know, from a strictly legal viewpoint, there are clear sanctions if you violate the norms that Alban and Emily were talking about. There are strict sanctions, but that requires a political will. But, you know, you can't hide things here in the space resources domain. I mean, we don't have CCTV cameras there, but we will, you know, everybody will be watching closely. This is highly, highly sensitive from a geopolitical viewpoint. Whatever goes on there, everybody will be watching. If activities are undertaken that clearly go beyond bounds of acceptability or these understandings, then there will be, you know, very severe, if you like, political consequences. And you might think, well, that means nothing, but that's not the way the world works, you know. Once you've shown yourself to be a poor actor in something as incredibly sensitive as this, then that will have deep, deep ramifications for your ability, because you can't do this alone. We've heard again and again that no one or two or three countries can do this alone. It is so complex. You need alliances, you need cooperation, you need technology, you need sharing of information. If you show yourself to be a bad actor, then you compromise your ability to harness that. But I'll defer to my colleagues.
Yeah, well, it's actually a matter of years now from us getting back to the moon, I mean, us internationally. So we actually see we don't have a lot of time left in order to manage those deconfliction rules. I think we should have to answer the question, the distributive reasoning between what is, where is private law and private international law more competent and public international law more competent. And I think we should not lose time to treat the question of property titles in public international law, because it's basically a private law and national law issue. Besides the urgent question of, neighboring on the moon, occupation on the moon, is basically the coordination of occupations on the moon is, I think, the most urgent matter. So let's not lose too much time in public international arenas speaking about property titles. Let's leave it to private law and national law coordination, because it's basically in private law and in basically on Earth. It has a significance more than in space. And let's coordinate internationally occupations in order to get deconflicted. And that's where multilateral agreements are important, because, well, if you want to enforce internationally Artemis Accord safety zones, you need to make them actually opposable internationally to third countries not being parties to the Artemis Accords. That's where we need a multilateral, real effort in order to ensure good neighboring on the moon, and especially the lunar South Pole. Well, it's not a big place, actually. The moon is quite small.
It's all relative.
I was just going to say, we have 60 seconds. I wanted to say, I agree. I think international coordination and implementation of the due regard principles in Article 9, I think, is a key area for international best practices and guidelines, and also sustainability, interoperability of technology, and promoting what we're going to do with equipment and structures after they've already been used. We don't want to leave a whole bunch of trash, I think, on the moon. And then on enforcement, a lot of that is done at the national level through our regulatory bodies. So the regulatory bodies have licenses to enforce, and a lot of the licenses are going to be addressing different aspects of states' obligations in the Outer Space Treaty. So we can also do enforcement at the national level.
I know that we've run out of time, but I really wanted to take a flavour of the questions in the room. So if the mic could just shoot around the questions, at least we'll hear a flavour of what the questions are. There's a hand up here, two hands up here, another hand up there. So as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I've got the mic. Look, just a very practical question. I mean, if law at the UN level is not developed quickly enough for commercial space resource activity, is the intention that for such activity to be governed by the Artemis Accords? And if so, do you think they are appropriate or they would enable financing, for example, to take place?
Okay, and if the mic would move to these, I'm just going to bucket together the questions at least, and then we might have some very sharp, quick answers. Go ahead, Stephen, on that one. And yep.
Yeah, I had a quick question for Alban, and it was about just the interpretation of the US and the Luxembourg laws, even though that might not be particularly your expertise, but both of those appear to have the intention of affirming ownership over resources that are extracted in accordance with international law. And they both include words of that nature. If you were a lawyer for an investment house looking to invest in that, would that give you some concern about whether there really is good title, or does that beg the question about what is, whether the extraction was or was not in accordance with international law?
Can we have extremely quick answers?
Sure. On the Artemis Accords, it applies specifically to civil space exploration. So it's covering NASA and other civil space agencies and that type of exploration. We hope that the Accords inspires private sector industry stakeholders to follow similar transparency and sustainability rules. But ultimately, at least U.S. Commercial activities in outer space will be governed by our regulatory process as a means of implementing our obligations under the Outer Space Treaty.
To answer the latter question, the last question actually, well, there is a great metaphor used by Francis Lyell and Paul Larson in their space law treaty. It is a duck test. If it sounds like a duck, looks like a duck, and works like a duck, it's a duck. And I think applied to interpretation of international space law, we basically get to it. My personal opinion, my personal legal analysis, is that actually you cannot you cannot deprive from what we call in French effet utile, but I think it's transferred in legal English. You cannot deprive Article 2 from its effet utile if you go too far beyond in recognizing property titles on lunar resources. But my core belief about it is actually we probably misinterpreted two things. One thing is to put occupation under Article 2. The other thing is to manage property titles acquired on space resources. And if I was actually doubtful originally on the American and Luxembourg interpretation of distinguishing surface from content, because it's basically what it means, I quite now understand it and could actually see as a probable solution to conform with Article 2. But legal certainty is going to be a big issue about property title on space resources. And even though, well, we need to get there and start exploiting resources, basically, to best know how you will do it technically, what surface of land it implies to excavate, use, and basically how much land you need to have for installations to exploit resources, and then we will see basically what it could mean legally.
I know I'm keeping everybody back, so I'll be very quick. Ben, thank you for your question. I'm not sure I entirely accept the premise that if international law doesn't work, we're going to go ahead anyway. I mean, I don't think that is a reality in terms of, you know, commercial exploitation. We're not at that point yet where that's going to happen very, very quickly anyway. But the point I have to make, and Emily made the point that at the international level it works slowly and everybody says it's frustratingly slow, et cetera, whatever is agreed at this international level through, you know, blood, sweat and tears of negotiation and lots of sidebar conversations and to get to the compromise position of what the rules are, whatever is agreed has to last not for 1 or 2 or 5 years, but for 20 or 30 or 40 years. Because, you know, once you've developed these standards, you don't change them. You might add to them later, but international processes don't allow for, you know, they're not going to sit down again in 2 years' time and change everything. And so in a sense, based on the knowledge you have now and in the next few years, you've got to get it as right as you can for the long period. So there will be some flexibility, as there should be, because as the technology develops, obviously things will not be specifically covered, but we've got to have general enough but fundamental enough principles to allow for responsible behaviour. That has happened for the last 65 years in space anyway. By and large, space has worked because we've got fundamental principles that still allow for flexibility as technology develops, as long as you fit within that. So, you know, I can't see companies going ahead and doing whatever they want without, you know, some fundamental rules in place, and the countries that have jurisdiction over them will want those fundamental rules as well. So, you know, I don't think we're going to see, you know, rogue companies doing things without at least some understanding, some common understandings, even at a high level. I hope not anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panel. Please give them a round of applause. I think we need more time next year on this panel. It's so important, and it's something that everybody has a view on, and lots of questions. If you have any more questions, please do put them in the chat, because I'm sure that you will be able to reply to those questions. There are quite a few about the Artemis Accords in the chat, directed to you, Emily. So do put them there, and I'm sure they will get around to answering them before the chat closes at the end of today. But the next panel is also very important. We're moving from law, and I must thank you also for the analogy there, Alban. I love the analogy that you as lawyers are the conductors,